Next, we have centralization versus subsidiarity in the MiCAR era. So the principle of subsidiarity, the EU's constitutional backbone, dictates that decisions should be taken at the lowest possible level, favoring national competent authorities. The approach preserves local expertise, agility, and the innovation-friendly environment of jurisdictions like Liechtenstein. However, the counter-argument for centralization points to the risk of regulatory arbitrage or jurisdiction shopping. If national enforcement varies widely, firms may simply seek the lightest touch, potentially undermining investor protection and financial stability access across the single market, and calls for direct supervision by bodies like ESMA for the largest firms are growing louder. For that conversation, I'm going to introduce you to your moderator. He is Erwin Volodymyr of the European Blockchain Council, and he's going to do a keynote with Mr. John Orchard of Offen.
Hi there, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We have a very interesting conversation in store. To my left is Mr. John Orchard of OMFIF. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I spend my life listening to arguments about versions of digital money. OMFIF is a central banking think tank originally, which has diversified into working out how the policy world responds to new versions of money, and it takes you from 1 minute talking about notes and coins being replaced to eventually the tokenization of everything.
It's a very fair assessment. So the broader topic of our discussion today is this general theme around centralization and subsidiarity. And you know, you and I had written about this recently in an OMFIF article, actually, where we're talking about kind of picking up on some of these, let's say, more meta-level themes on whether Europe risks becoming a flyover zone and what this means for kind of the local flavor versus this centralizing aspect of supervision. You just recently got back from the IMF fall meetings. What was the sentiment? Maybe we can start with stateside and then we'll kind of come back to Europe. What was the sentiment across the pond? How is the US approaching some of these issues, and what are the signals that this is sending potentially for us over in Europe?
The Genius Act has changed everything. So we've mentioned that earlier today, and everyone is watching very closely what the executive wants. The executive in Donald Trump and the team around him are really setting the agenda, we know that. The Genius Act, which is a stablecoin regulation, has changed everything everywhere in terms of versions of money. So before the Genius Act, MiCAR was actually an incredibly progressive thing. So people regarded it as perhaps a bit restrictive, but at least it was clear, while the States was in a very complicated partisan wrangle about digital assets, with Democrat politicians in particular trying to prevent crypto firms, which they regarded as somehow a new version of evil capitalism to be thwarted. That's completely gone away. The Genius Act is moving at pace, so there are now companies setting up stable coins to be approved by the OCC. Circle and Tether have become crypto royalty in the meanwhile, and companies related to them like Coinbase have. The rest of the world is trying to work out how to respond, and it's perhaps going in an unusual direction. In Europe, the response is to speed up versions of public money. So the view of the European Central Bank and most European policymakers, perhaps even including Peter, we heard from him earlier, is that markets are going to need public money to settle in. The US view is that, at the moment anyway, you could use private money in the form of stablecoins to settle wholesale transactions. So the discussion at the IMF was on that, whether this bold experiment in private money in a tokenized form can take over capital markets as a wholesale instrument, or in fact, Europe is curiously correct in moving faster than the Fed actually at creating public versions of money, certainly already at a wholesale level, in order to facilitate tokenization of European economy, notwithstanding a whole load of other problems we can come on to.
Yeah. And now, you were mentioning kind of this concepts around public money, and we had, at least during the Biden administration, kind of, let's say, some antagonisms, some challenges between some of the state charters that were issuing, special purpose licenses for state-sponsored or state-chartered stablecoin issuers versus whatever was happening at the federal level or not happening at the federal level. So there's still there was some antagonism between centralization and subsidiarity at the U.S. from the state to the federal level. But in Europe, we have a different situation, and there was a recent piece that came out from 3 European regulators, from Italy's CONSOB, from the Austrian FMA, and from France's AMF, where they were specifically calling for these tighter requirements for so-called significant CASPs. And we could make the argument maybe that centralization and subsidiarity is as old as Charlemagne, really. And it's a uniquely European issue that we've been wrangling with. But when we take it to the era of digital finance, what do you see as maybe the main drivers for this push towards centralization? Why are some NCAs themselves even calling for it? And is there an argument that we should preserve local flavor to arrive at this kind of competitive future and outlook that Peter was discussing earlier?
I would say the answer to that, to use Freud's language for dream analysis, there's manifest content and there's latent content. So the manifest content, the obvious content, is, of course, it makes sense to have pan-European supervision as part of the Capital Markets Union drive. So people typically talk, and Draghi talked last year in his report about Europe, about an incredibly fragmented capital market. Banking union is basically nowhere, and Capital Markets Union isn't either. The countries can't even agree on bankruptcy standards, as you know, or deposit insurance for the Eurozone. Usually is thanks to mostly German bank lobbying, actually. So there is an obvious prima facie case for pan-European regulation and supervision of things. Why these regulators are pushing for it, the suspicion is, I've heard on good authority, that certain member states, there's a big member state that speaks French, for example, which would like to gain control of MiCAR and actually to have a restrictive interpretation, a Napoleonic, shall we say, interpretation of it, to prevent the kind of things that actually Peter and his team originally wanted it to enable.
Okay. And you mentioned Draghi, you mentioned competitiveness. A big issue has been this kind of Franco-German entente, or at least at some point kind of butting heads over what a CMU should look like, now SIU. And recently Chancellor Merz came out with some comments where he may propose or may support the proposal of a single European stock exchange, kind of in line with this French proposal, but curiously omitting crypto from that part of the discussion, that bit of the discussion. This sort of, it doesn't necessarily dovetail with kind of that approach. Crypto's kind of left orthogonally. Do you think that perhaps if we're trying to say that something or some entity is a significant CASP, that we're not quite there yet in terms of establishing what the thresholds for that are? Because we have this in the significance regime for the arts and EMTs. We have no such equivalency for what a significant CASP is, and potentially this is why maybe Berlin is thinking, kind of leave this out of that discussion for now?
I'm hoping Chancellor Merz read our article, actually, Irving. So in the article, we set out the case why, even though superficially it makes sense to have a single supervisor for MiCAR, MiCAR didn't envisage that, and there is an argument, which I've also heard from the Commission, that since the need for innovation is urgent, Europe is being left behind now because of Genius, VARA in Dubai, some work in Hong Kong and elsewhere, that innovation is the order of the day, and you're more likely to get that if you have national competent authorities somewhat competing with one another to interpret the standards, albeit within a common set of agreed rules owned by the Commission. And actually what the Commission proposes, and it's quite an interesting theory is that this system self-regulates, because if one jurisdiction really oversteps the mark, you would expect another jurisdiction to complain. If it's not really overstepping the mark, but it's testing the limits, they probably won't, because otherwise they'll invite a reciprocal complaint. So this is quite a slimly peopled system using the national regulators, essentially policing one another. And the Commission view at the moment from people I've spoken to is that you'll sooner get much quicker innovation under the auspices of MiCAR with that arrangement than if you hire 500 civil servants and attach them to ESMA in Paris and then ask them to control MiCAR. And doing that would also require that MiCAR is reopened, which has all the risks that Peter talked about earlier.
Yeah, to include things like staking and DAOs and DeFi, and we're still waiting on the Article 142 report in the meantime.
Yeah.
Do you think that it's also fair to say that a lot of member states have kind of taken the time to build up their expertise? Like, I mean, there was this assessment of Malta's regime, but to their credit, Malta had a regime 5 years before MiCA, and there's other member states that have invested the time, the resources to staff and get the personnel on board and get them up to speed, not only with MiCA but with DORA, so the broader kind of constellation of the digital finance package, that this centralization tendency might undercut not only the efficiency gains that could have been reaped from these local jurisdictions, but in the end, it's kind of an overshoot to avoid the gold plating under MiFID that's just going to have these knock-on effects that are going to be kind of deleterious to the success of this industry?
Exactly. Well, you mentioned MiFID. That's a very good example. You mentioned it in our article. That didn't quite work because it was gold-plated. And the fact is, there are cultural differences to money and innovation in different European jurisdictions. So we heard earlier that Liechtenstein was actually a early innovator. It's not in the European Union, but is in the EEA, was an early innovator and has that culture. As you know, the Baltic states did similar. Malta, which I think felt patronized by the French intervention as well, whereas Ireland, for example, is quite conservative. We know the big member states, France and Germany, have complicated views. They're essentially conservative with pockets of innovation, including in their central banks. But wish to prevent also regulatory arbitrage by innovative activities at the fringe, even though that may be in Europe's interest.
You've written previously also on this, and it dovetails with our discussion, on this issues around multi-issuance and,
Yes.
and kind of we could say the premonitions coming from certain central banking institutions that this constitutes a systemic threat to monetary sovereignty, or that this could lead to run risk or other issues that are related to kind of the liquidity backstop of the digital asset space in Europe. And where do you think that discussion on multi-issuance fits into this broader concept around centralization and subsidiarity? Is it fair to say that those warning of these risks is premature, or that we as a market are in a situation where, because this is on-chain, it's 24/7, it's global, that some of the things we're talking about in terms of collateral eligibility and where that collateral should be posted might itself be missing the mark?
I think this is a really important question, and as you say, I wrote about this. Europe has a really difficult choice to make here. Peter mentioned earlier that Europe risks becoming a flyover zone if it doesn't get some of this right, despite being an early legislator with MiCAR. Because if you don't have versions of money, of on-off ramps into tokenization, you can't go, it's just not going to take off on a wholesale basis. There are all sorts of other problems, including risk weights that we can come back to, but you are going to need digital money. There is not yet a big euro-denominated stablecoin, although we heard from one earlier that's trying to be one. We've got Forge from SG, and actually the regulations are quite restrictive and very bank-focused. So if there isn't a big euro-denominated stablecoin, how are you going to on-off ramp into the tokenized environment that we want to gain? You might well have to use what the European Council called a American oligopolistic entities such as Circle or Tether. So there is a view that says, why not allow the incumbent Americans that know what they're doing to issue in Europe, even if there's a risk that perhaps if there is a contagion event in the US, that's a financial stability risk for Europe, in order to facilitate the rest of tokenization, or should Europe somehow keep them at the door while a euro-denominated stablecoin emerges as the on-off ramp? That's the tension. So I think from what I heard from the Commission, it's a complicated row. The Council doesn't want the Americans involved. The MiCAR foresaw that it would be possible in order that you can facilitate the rest of tokenization.
Yeah, and we're still waiting on the Q&A on multi-issuance from the Commission in general, so hopefully we'll get some clarity on this soon. One final question to leave you with. If regulators keep pushing this issue of multi-issuance the way that they have and are coming out wholesale against it, does that risk just recreating the frictions we saw, which would have been enormous benefits for some under the Eurodollar system? Is this essentially just putting that same thing that Susan Strange would have argued, but just putting it on different rails?
I think that's a very good question. So the Eurodollar market, which eventually became the global bond market as we have it now, is essentially a money regime organized by the private sector outside the US to avoid withholding tax originally, but denominated in the American currency. And the risk is that you will simply, if you're too restrictive in Europe, drive Europe-denominated finance offshore in order to avoid the restrictive covenants. Whether that will be London, I don't know. London is experimenting. London is making a bit of a mess, actually, of working out how to regulate this space, and the Bank of England is zigzagging between wanting to stop stablecoins and trying to enable them, but is discussing, as you know, reciprocal arrangements with the US, where we would have reciprocal recognition of our digital assets regulation.
With Besant recently meeting with Reeves. And,
exactly. And if that takes off, I don't know if it will, but if it does, you may go back, as you say, to the Eurodollar situation, where London reinvents itself as a digital capital market, which people use because the private sector has organized it in a way that's useful outside of the perimeters of regulation. So there is that risk that if you end up with a very restrictive pan-European regulator that is essentially trying to reinforce things that member states didn't want from stable coins and other digital assets, that you do get Peter's flyover zone. That's the risk.
Well, John, thank you for your time. I think we've said all we can in the space that we were given. We'll be following the space closely, and hopefully we don't end up a flyover zone, and this continues to be a beacon of investment and progress, and Europe can kind of move forward with the digital assets industry as it grows.
I think so, and as I say, the public money is now moving at speed in Europe. The ECB is moving really quickly, which I didn't expect. Q3 next year, that you will have a version of wholesale CBDC for markets to settle in. That's a really big deal. The Fed can't do that. And if they solve the risk weight stuff, actually Europe might be the tortoise that wins the race because of that. Let's
Slow
see.
and steady.
Yeah.
Round of applause for John, ladies and gentlemen.